Welcome to another exciting episode of Knife Chats with Tobias, almost live. This episode was recorded in front of a live studio audience. Well, it was recorded in front of a live cam. Any case, hope you enjoy the show. Well, if you read the description, then you already know that this almost live is going to be on my thoughts on the Rough Ryder Reserve line of knives and the direction I think SMKW should go with it. When I first started to do this video, I thought it was going to be about a 10 or 15 minute video, and once again it turned into a marathon. And after looking at it, I thought, well, maybe I'll just make it an almost live. Now normally when I do an almost live, I usually try to break it up with a public service announcement from Jackalope Jake and then also a commercial from the Volcano Clubs featuring Skip the Show. But because of the nature of this particular topic, I'm not going to do that in this instant. It's just going to be me talking about the Rough Ryder Reserve line of knives, where they are now, where I think they've made a misstep, and then where I hope they go in the future with the lineup. All of this is trying to be positive about the Rough Ryder Reserve line of knives, even though they have disappointed me a little bit. All in all, I think it's an excellent concept, and I'm hoping to see great things in the Rough Ryder Reserve knives in the immediate future. Okay, without further ado, let's take a look at my thoughts on the Rough Ryder Reserve line of knives in this August 2021 Knife Chats with Tobias almost live. I thought I would join you today to talk a little bit about the Rough Ryder Reserve line of knives. Now these are the higher priced Rough Ryders that currently have come out with micarta scales and D2 tool steel blades and things of that nature. Some people are buying every one of them. I currently have two. I'm waiting for another one to be returned. I had one that was bad, sent it back, and I think that's what's really the driving force of this actual video. Now, before I go on to what I think they should be doing with the Rough Ryder Reserve line of knives, let me tell you what some people have been saying. And one of them is that these knives are every bit as good as like a GEC. They say they're GEC in quality. I don't buy that. And I also am not one of those people who compare the Rough Ryder Reserve knives with GEC or Case. What I compare the Rough Ryder Reserve knives to is, well, other Rough Ryders. I look at a regular Rough Ryder and I look at the Rough Ryder Reserve knife and I say, is this knife worth the more money that I'm paying than just a regular Rough Ryder? And I got a feeling, in all honesty, that's what a lot of other fans of Rough Ryders are doing. They're looking at these and saying, what am I getting in this knife that I'm not getting in this knife? And if the only answer to that is D2 tool steel, they're saying that's not enough. And for good reason. And that is mainly because Rough Ryder knives are really well-made, solid knives. So why am I going to spend $18 for a knife like this and then spend $60 for a knife like this and it not be that much better? And that is something that the folks at SMKW and Rough Ryder need to resolve. If you're going to expect a person to pay 2 or 3 times more or 4 times more for the knife, they're going to expect that knife to be comparably that much better than a regular Rough Ryder. So part of the problem that the folks at SMKW and Rough Ryder have set for themselves is they have made such an excellent knife to begin with. People will often compare a Rough Ryder knife to a case knife that costs 3 or 4 times better. So when you're doing this Rough Ryder Reserve knife, then yeah, they are expecting it to be in the same kind of quality as a Great Eastern cutlery knife. And quite frankly, these knives are not up to Great Eastern cutlery standards. That's just a fact of life. I know some people say that, but I guess they just haven't had enough Great Eastern knives. For instance, here's my unexcelled possum skinner by Great Eastern Cutlery. This is in the Northfield lineup, so this is their ones that are a little bit higher in line. But, well, the finish is really good on here. The knife is nice and slim. It's nothing really bulky or anything. Notice this is a 2-blade design. Notice how close those blades are to each other. Yet, despite that, you don't have any blade rub. What the Rough Ryder Reserve Line has done is they have put enormously large spacers in between the blades, and just so that you will not have blade rub. That's not the way to get rid of it. Just be more exact in your lineup to begin with. And they do have excellent lineup. Notice how well those are lined up. See how that is spot on in the center. You've got good blade centering on both sides there. If you've got that good of blade centering in there, why did you put such a thick brass liner or brass spacer in between those springs? No spacer in between those springs because they've got excellent lineup on the blades and it just fits nicely. So you've got a gap in here that you can actually lose change in between. That's not the answer to making sure you don't have blade rub. Just do it right to begin with and don't put in a big spacer there just to sort of prevent blade rub that may or may not happen. If you have good quality control, you don't need to take unnecessary measures like that. You do that, and this knife is a much thinner knife and not nearly as bulky in the hand, not nearly as bulky in the pocket. People will be happier with it. So you use those spacers when you need to use a spacer, not when you don't need a spacer. You often will see a very thin spacer between trapper blades. That makes sense. On this knife, you didn't really need that spacer in there. For instance, this knife, this has a more traditional pattern. This was one that they just found in the catalog and brought back, and they built it the way they were supposed to. 3 blades, and it's thinner than this 2-bladed knife. See that? It's actually thinner with 3 blades because they just stuck with a pattern that was already out there. Is there a little blade rub? Maybe, but nothing dramatic. And quite frankly, on a knife like this, I would expect blade rub. But the action on these blades is really no better than what you get on a regular Rough Ryder. They brag about the half stops. I could care less about half stops. I'm sorry, I'm not the big one on half stops. I haven't bought that game. But they also talk about the finish of the knife and why they're going with a satin finish on the D2 steel. I don't know. They could get this to a mirror polish and that would make all the difference in the world. Are they worried that the finish will not be as good if they try to get a mirror polish on those blades? Here's the satin finish on this beaver tail. This is in the Titty-Ute lineup. That's their satin finish. Look at the difference in satin finishes even. The GEC has a shinier satin finish than the Rough Ryder, and it's a better slicer. So I would much rather have the Great Eastern satin finish on a Titty-Ute knife than the satin finish I'm seeing on the Rough Ryder Reserve. And quite frankly, what we should be seeing on that knife is the mirror polish that we see in the Northfield line. That's really what I am expecting in a Rough Ryder Reserve line of knives. Notice that nice shine there? You don't have it here. But that's what you should be seeing in the Rough Ryder Reserve line of knives. A mirror polish is a sign of quality in my book. Satin finish, that's just something that is great for hiding scratches. Here is a old Rough Ryder trapper. This is one of the early ones. I'm going to show you the back side because of the blade etch on the front. But see that? Even that mirror polish looks better than this satin finish. And so their satin finish to me does not look as good as the mirror polish on their regular line of knives. And like I said, I think more people are going to compare the Rough Ryder Reserves to the regular line of Rough Ryder knives, and it better be 3 or 4 times better. That's what they're going to look at. I know that's a subjective thing, but they're going to say, if I'm paying $18 for this knife and I'm paying $60 for this knife, it better be 3 times better than this knife. How they're going to judge that is up to them, but one of the things they are going to look at is, wow, this has got really shiny blades, this has got really dull blades. I don't like the dull blades. Maybe some people will like the dull blades, but I think for most traditional knife collectors, satin finish is not the way to go. Mirror polish is the way to go. Nickel silver shield is not pinned. I think a lot of people would like to see that pinned on a reserve line of knives, because both of those shields are just glued in place. If you're going to have a reserve line, a better line of knives, then pin the shields like Great Eastern does. If you want to be compared to Great Eastern, you better have your shields pinned. In any case, let me talk about now some of the patterns that I think they should be looking at in round 2 of the Rough Ryder Reserve line of knives, because quite frankly, I was not overly impressed with the knives that showed up in round 1, especially this one. And so that's where I'm going to start off with. I don't get why this knife was among the very first 8 knives that was released in the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. I mean, let's face it, there was only, I think this is the only one, and the Razor Jack that were even remotely a typical pattern. So for the knives to be going back and looking at old patterns and bringing them to life again, these are the only 2. This and the Razor Jack are the only ones that were really pulled right out of the catalog almost. All the other ones had something done to them. And some of them were really out there, like the bar back. This is one of the few knives of regret that I have. I'm still not sure why I went ahead and bought this knife. Just not comfortable to use at all. And to me, it would have made a lot more sense for SMKW to play it a little safer with those first 8 knives and bring in a knife that, traditional pattern guys flock to. And that was the trapper. I don't understand why there wasn't a trapper in the lineup of the first 8. Maybe they were thinking, no, we're not going to hit them with a trapper. Everyone makes a trapper. We got to think outside the box. Well, yes, you do need to think outside the box a little bit, but this might have been a little bit too far outside of the box, and you should have played it safe with at least something in the trapper family in that first 8. It did not need to be a standard trapper like this knife, but I think you should have had a trapper in there. And I think that in your next line of knives, you should probably throw in a trapper. Now, and this is coming from a guy who does not like trappers. I do not, as a rule, collect trapper knives, but you need one in the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. And for that reason, that's why I was showing this one earlier. This is a trapper. This is a dogleg trapper. This was in the Rough Ryder Trapper series a long time ago, and they really do not produce this knife that often. And it's just a beautiful knife. You can see it right there. Look at the back of it there, and look at the build on that. The build on this is really good. Is it perfect? No, but that's what I would expect. I would expect to see something like this in the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. It's a big knife too. It's not small. Well, let's just compare it to a regular trapper. You see there, it's about a ½ inch longer than a regular trapper, so about 4 3/8 inches long. You got a beautiful clip blade going on with it, and you got a pretty exotic spade blade. And notice the spade blade opens from the back side. So, not your typical trapper, and something that looks very elegant. And this is something I could have seen in the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup and said, yeah, I'm going to buy me one of those. And notice also thickness there. Notice it's got a proper spacer in the middle. It isn't too big, it isn't too large. It's a proper spacer for a trapper. So let me get these blades open real quick, and we'll talk about what we got going on here. Now, most trappers will have a full spacer in between the blades, so each blade will drop into its own channel. But notice the thickness of that brass liner there. Now, these blades, you see the gap in between there. And yes, these are thicker blades, but at the same time, look at how wide both channels are on there for two blades versus this. And the difference is these blades do not need that spacer at all because of how far apart they are to begin with. The reason they do this with trappers is so that they do not rub and that they have a place to live. You don't need that on this knife or on the bar back, but you do kind of need it with a trapper. Also, because of what a trapper is used for, that spacer, the full spacer there, gives the knife a little bit of added strength so that it is going to be able to do some tough chores, more than just opening a bottle of beer. So that's why the trapper is designed the way it is designed. And that is really something that needs to be considered when you're doing these Rough Ryder Reserve knives. And quite frankly, this to me looks like a Rough Ryder Reserve kind of knife. It's nice, it's elegant, it is big, it's definitely a handful at 4 3/8 inches long, but it's not, it doesn't look like it's going to be real chunky in the hand or chunky in the pocket. And the blades have some really good lines with it. So I could see taking this knife, putting in like VG10 stainless steel blades or D2 carbon steel blades, taking maybe something like, well, a better bone handle than this, and that's going to be hard to beat because this has got some of the best looking bone that Rough Ryder has ever put on a knife. But you make sure that that bone is nicely matched on both sides. Make sure that the shield is pinned into the front bone, and then, you know, let the knife talk to it, speak for itself. You know, this knife already is, I tell you what, I could picture this knife. People would not be able to tell the difference between this knife and a GEC other than the fact that you're talking 440A instead of 1095 carbon steel and the tank stamp on there. So this is a quality, well-made knife. Is it perfect? No, but that's where they step it up. So I would like to see a trapper, this style of trapper, in the Rough Ryder Reserve line. And this is a tried and tested pattern that Rough Ryder has already had. This is something that Stuart Harvey had mentioned. He was expecting them to take tried and true patterns and improve on them. Not throw them out the window and remake them, but improve on the fit, the finish, the quality, the blade steel, things of that nature. I don't think micarta is a step up above a natural bone handle. Maybe carbon fiber, something like that. But really, doing the old-fashioned stuff of pinning the shield would be a better option. But anyway, there's one of them I'd love to see. The Rough Ryder Dogleg Trapper, now in the Rough Ryder Reserve series line. Now, if you've watched my channel, you know about this knife already. This is the 078 Rough Ryder, and this is actually a copy off of a knife that was made by Moki out of Seki City, Japan. But this knife has some of the prettiest lines I have seen in a Rough Ryder knife. Now, the fit and finish of this is not the world's greatest at all. You've got a pin that you can fill right there, pin you can fill right there. The burl wood is natural, so it changes from knife to knife. I've got multiples of this knife because I like it so much, but you can see in this one, it has stainless steel bolsters going on it, and it has a stainless steel blade. No lock on the blade at all because it is a backlock blade. But look at the lines on that knife. That knife just has some beautiful lines on it. And so this is one of those knives where, yeah, throw in VG10, throw in a D2 tool steel blade, highly polish everything, get this thing mirror polished, and put on a good handle here. And maybe instead of putting the, either way, pin that shield into the handle, or etch it into the bolster, something of that nature, one of the two. Or etch the, that RRR, etch that on the top of the bolster there, and then go ahead and put your shield in. I don't know if you need to put them both on there or not. But you put a really nice handle on this and you finish this off properly, and we're talking a beautiful, beautiful little liner lock that has some really cool lines on it and everything else. I can definitely see something like that in the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup because, well, first of all, that's probably my favorite Rough Ryder. Why wouldn't I want to see something like that in the Rough Ryder Reserves? And the fact that you throw on a stag handle like this, a stag handle or a pearl handle on this, they're selling almost a nearly identical Moki in the hundreds of dollars of ranges as opposed to a $60 range. So you put a decent handle on that, I'm in it. I'll buy that one. And I don't know, just a beautiful little knife. So there's one I would love to see in the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. And seriously, now this is by Queen. It's a little boy's knife. This is a prototype that I also got out of Smoky Mountain Knife Works. But I don't understand why, if you're looking at classic designs, if you're looking at knives that just endure from the past forever, then we're talking the boy's knife. And I could see this knife being tossed into a Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. Yes, it is very simple, and that's one of the things I think they need to consider doing, keeping it simple, but make it perfect. You know, a nice boy's knife would be a great addition to the lineup. This one is a spear point blade. I think that would be more than perfect, but yeah, you could consider doing a drop point into this or something, you know, a little more of a drop point, and go ahead and throw your swedge in there if you definitely need that swedge. But a boy's knife, why not? Maybe a bareheaded boy's knife. And yeah, I know it's very close to a Barlow, but we'll get to that in a minute, because I think a Barlow should be in there, but not your typical Barlow. But yeah, a boy's knife. There is nothing more classic than a simple jackknife, and it's something that really needs to be considered. And I also think a cattle knife would be a perfect knife for the set. And yeah, these are another big one. It seems like you like to make big knives. Why not a cattle knife? This one by Marbles, it's even called a cattle knife. You know, has a nice spear blade. I'm sorry, a nice clip blade, you could either go with that, or you could go with a Spear Master blade. And if you go with the Spear Master blade instead of going with the pin blade, maybe throw in a spay blade or a sheepfoot blade, or the dreaded Warncliffe. If you're still on your Warncliffe kick, go ahead and throw in a Warncliffe blade on a cattle knife, as long as you also got a spear blade on it or something. I would not make the main blade on any future Rough Ryder Reserve knife a Warncliffe blade unless you're making a whittler. The Warncliffe blade, I know everyone is still talking about how popular they are, but they're not really nearly as functional as people think they are. A good old-fashioned clip blade or a good old-fashioned spear blade is a much more useful blade than a Warncliffe blade unless you're doing a lot of whittling. And so consider those blades. Like I said, keep it simple. Think about your clip blades, think about your spear point blades, and work from there instead of saying, what cool blade can we put on this knife to make it different? There's a reason these blades are been around for so long. It's because they work. And we're talking traditional knives, so it's knives that traditional folks like. And as much as the Warncliffe is liked, it's usually not the best blade for a main blade. It's a much better secondary blade, in my opinion. Unless, of course, you're talking a whittler. Now, this one's probably going to be a little controversial, but I think this would be a fantastic knife to have in the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup, and you have not done it in the past, but it would be pretty cool. And that is something like this. This is the Picnic King by Colonial. And what you have on it is obviously your spoon. And you've got a fork. And you've got a Spear Master blade. And as you can guess, the whole thing comes apart. It's one of those take-apart knives. And I think that would be a fantastic thing to have in the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. And this would actually compete well against the Case Hobo knife. But we're talking about a different pattern with a larger spoon and a more functional fork. And you could actually take and work in a cap lifter into the fork blade if you wanted to do that. So that would also be cool. Pretty sure you could, because let's see. I think they put it on. You could do one with that, but I think the spoon would be a much better option. Have a nice spoon on your knife. The main blade. With instructions on how to put it back together, obviously. And your fork. On a nice take-apart knife. This is, like I said, the Picnic King. Rough Ryder has not done one of these before, but I think this would be a great idea to throw into the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. Let's see, we'll move you there, put you there. Now, I know you knew I was going to get around to doing a powder horn of some kind, and I'm actually going to talk about a couple different powder horns. But I think a powder horn definitely needs to be in there. I know they're not as popular now, but they were a big deal, and one of them, well, was used by the Army Air Force during World War II as an emergency fishing knife. And this knife is very popular among collectors. A lot of collectors are out looking for this knife, and I've heard many people say, make another one of them. And the cool thing about this is the removable bail at the top of the knife instead of down at the bottom. You got the hook remover on the bottom here, and if you notice, you got the scaler on the portion of the blade right up here. And if you can see here, you've got a liner lock on the blade, and so you've got a locking fish knife, which is basically a bird and trout knife here. It was actually used during World War II. It's got a nice blade geometry going and just a nice look on the hand. And well, you got a liner lock for it, a bail at the wrong end so it's out of the way, a hook remover, and it's a toothpick. So there are toothpick fans out there, not as many as Trapper fans, not as many as Stockman fans. I know they're not the best selling knives in the world, but if you're really looking for classic knives from the past that you want to throw into the Rough Ryder Reserve line, this is one to go for, and no one is really making it, so it'd be great in the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. And as long as we're still on powder horns or toothpicks, consider this one, the Navajo Pattern, which is basically Spanish for dock knife, and no one really makes any of these, especially in the United States. It's got the interesting little ratcheting lock up on the top, and you've got a very interesting blade geometry going, and the blade locks because of this lock here. You press down, press up, and the blade breaks loose, and then you can close it. Now, there is an inherent design flaw with these kind of knives, and that is they have significant blade wrap. So you might want to figure out a way to solve the blade wrap on the old Navajos. And these are knives that collectors are always looking for, and they get very expensive on the secondary market, especially the ones that ratchet. I'm not telling you to make it to ratchet or anything. This one just rolls around. But if you were ratcheting, then that would even be better. They come in different thicknesses too, so you can make it a little fatter if you're looking for something a little fatter. Blades change a little bit, but you see you got the lock there, and to break it open, and as you can tell, blade wrap. So you'd have to solve the blade wrap problem. But I think this is a knife that a lot of people would look at and say, yeah, I want one of those. Because come on, let's face it, Cold Steel even rips this off for some of their knives. The Navajos, they're popular. They may not be as popular as Trappers and everything, but in a Rough Ryder Reserve lineup, considering some of the other knives you put in there, something like a Navajo would be an excellent option, I think. And another one you don't see that often is this one here. This is a Stanhope style bartender knife. You got a little peep show going on right there. You got a little magnifying glass right there, and if you look inside there, there's a little image on the inside. Actually, I think it's peeping from, nope, yeah, it's peeping from this side. And so you could put a little picture in there of like a Rough Ryder or something on the inside, or SMKW, or even Kevin Pipes, and then make a Rough Ryder Reserve Stanhope with the corkscrew on the back side there. And now a lot of them have a label cutter, but go to the ones that were made in the 1910s, 1920s, and they've replaced the label cutter with a more appropriate bottle opener, even though it is pointy and has a little bit of a file there. The purpose of this is actually to open bottles, not to cut foil or anything, even though it is sharp enough on the end to cut foil off of a bottle. So this is actually a very multi-purpose blade going on there. And then you have your Spearmaster blade and a secondary pin blade that's almost as long as the Spearmaster blade. So it's just a cool looking knife. It isn't something you see every day. It is definitely a classic. And yeah, these were knives that were given away in taverns and stuff, so they were not necessarily very expensive. Later on they became a little more expensive, but I think this would be a great knife to throw in the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. A Stanhope style bartender tool. Okay, this last one is more or less a concept knife, something that would be taking 2 or 3 knives that are already out there and kind of mashing them up into something new. Not necessarily that new. It's
They have been sort of around, but I'd like to see it a little bit clearer. I know they've been around a little bit because here's the electric mate, which is an electrician's Barlow, with a sheepfoot blade and a little screwdriver with a sharpened edge. And this is really what's inspiring this next idea, is to take this knife and put it on a proper frame. Put it on the frame of a TL29 or something similar to the TL29, but widen that frame out a little bit like you have with the half hawk here or the old Doom Fixer, but give it what you're calling the half hawk blade here. So put this blade on an electrician knife, give it a Barlow style bolster, but not a rounded one, a squared off Barlow style bolster like there. So the bolster will end up being about 1/3 of the knife length. And then leave the secondary blade, which is your screwdriver blade. So imagine this with really big bolsters. And where is it at? Where is it at? The half hawk blade. Imagine that blade coming out of your electrician knife. And imagine it with that style of bolster, a nice big bolster. But keep the loop on the back. Keep it a functional electrician knife with your lanyard loop on the back here, or whatever you want to call it, bail, that's what we call it. And keep the brass liner lock in the middle. And in this case, this is a knife where you do go ahead and put on like the G10 or a really good like cocoa bolo wood handle. In any case, that's what I'm thinking, you know. A new style of electrician knife, a cattle knife, a hobo knife, a fish knife, a new Navajo, a dogleg trapper, this funky little knife, which is also more or less a Barlow style knife, but with some really sleek lines going on, and a Stanhope style bartender knife, something like that. Those are the kind of knives I would like to see in a Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. Not something like this ever again. This was interesting. I applaud you for the effort. Matter of fact, I still love the line of the handle, but you got to figure out something else, some other kind of blade to put in there, and maybe just make one blade on this kind of handle. That might work out then. Any case, like I said, what you need to do in the future with the Rough Ryder Reserve knives is just keep it simple. Don't overthink what you're doing, and don't overbuild the knives. Trust in your quality control. Don't sit there and try and find ways so that they can get away from not doing proper quality control. Trust in your quality control. Hold them to the standards that you have, and just keep it simple and don't overthink it. And then look for those tried and true patterns that are often forgotten in the past, that look interesting to you, because if they're interesting to you and others, that you definitely have a group that you're working off of, bounce the ideas off of them. And if it's a really cool pattern, people are going to say, yeah, I like that one, let's go for it. And also ask yourself, when you're putting these knives together, if you're thinking of making a change in a blade choice, like I was talking with the electrician knife, ask yourself, does that blade make any sense on that knife? Don't think about, how can I put a Wharncliffe blade on this knife, and how can I put a Wharncliffe blade on that knife, or wouldn't this knife be really kind of cool looking if we put a big spade blade in there? And it's like, well, why would you have a spade blade on that knife, or why should you have a Wharncliffe blade on that knife? Think about those questions, because we're thinking those questions. Why does this blade make any sense on this knife? And if it doesn't make any sense on that knife, don't put it on there. Like I said, keep it simple. And really just have fun with it, and don't make promises that you can't keep with it either. Don't say this knife is every bit as good as a GEC. Let us tell you that it's every bit as good as a GEC. Don't tell us what to think. Let us tell you what we think. And from there, work on meeting the goal that you want to make. So if you want these knives to be as good as GEC, listen to our feedback and go from there and say, all right, what part of what complaints that they're making are actual legitimate complaints, and what complaints are just people saying, oh, it's made in China, screw it, I don't want it. Because I know you're getting a lot of negative feedback that is not really helpful at all. And I'm hoping that the feedback you're getting in this video is positive feedback that can help grow the Rough Ryder Reserve line, because I do want to see it succeed, and I do want to be able to pick up more of them in the future. And also, if you notice, I did not stick with just D2. Consider other steels, VG10, ATS34, other steels that people will go, yes, that is a step up above 440A. I'm willing to spend a little bit of extra money for that knife, especially depending on what else you put on the handles. And don't shy away from some of the old handle materials like acrylics and stuff, because if done right, and we know that from Michael Prater and his use of Coralon, if done right, acrylic handles will actually help sell knives. In any case, with that said, I am going to call it a day with my thoughts on the future of Rough Ryder Reserves.
And there you have it. There's my thoughts on the Rough Ryder knives currently being produced and where I hope they go with the line in the future. But I'm just one voice, and I could be way off base on all of this. So I would love to hear in the comments below what you think of the Rough Ryder Reserve knives, and what you would like to see them doing in the future with the Rough Ryder Reserve lineup. And seriously, it does no good to just say it sucks. You got to tell me why it sucks. Or if you think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, then you need to tell me why you think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And if you're looking at the future of Rough Ryder Reserves, just what kind of knives are you looking to see in the Rough Ryder Reserve line? What kind of materials do you want to see used? What kind of blade finish do you want to see? What patterns do you want to see? Where do you want the Rough Ryder Reserve line to go? Is it on track right now? Is it off track? I don't know. But I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Thank you.
And that brings us to the conclusion of another exciting episode of Knife Chats with Tobias Almost Live. If you liked what you saw, give us that thumbs up and leave us a comment. We always like to hear from you here at Knife Chats with Tobias. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'll know when the next exciting episode of Knife Chats with Tobias is up and running. But thanks again, and we'll see you soon.